Hello. So we are going to do a video for Brian on the interrelationship of sword and how it translates into our striking, really on every aspect of the system as a whole. Because essentially, the sword becomes a focal point for us. And there are some very compelling reasons for that. This is going to be about a 3-part series to clear this up. And the focus is going to be on understanding how to look at sword properly. Because in order for us to become excellent, we have to have an understanding about why things are done that way with a sword and how that becomes relevant for other skill sets. Okay? So, the first thing in order is to see why. Why do we choose to use the sword as our primary focal point? And the reasons for that have to do with 3 things primarily: distance, timing, and intent. Okay? Distance, timing, and intent are the 3 key elements that allow one to be functional with their technique, and they are best learned and understood in a situation where the margin for error is the least. In this case, during a sword combat scenario, you cannot really get touched. Okay? Sort of like getting touched with a bullet. That's called getting shot. When we look at bladed weapons and long bladed weapons, you have to be very good and good enough so that your skill makes it so you don't get cut. And if you can manage that, then it sets a high benchmark for your other skill sets. And we're going to learn a little bit about how that benchmark is attained. But first, let's talk a little bit about in the past and traditionally how those benchmarks have been established for knife systems, okay? A lot of what you see in conventional knife fighting systems is stuff that is done from traditions that has to be reinterpreted and reworked for combat applications, okay? A lot of drills that you see encourage different habits that are dangerous, like staying in one place during a confrontation, okay? Doing a lot of very quick movements with your hands and not using your footwork, your angles, etc., okay? Traditionally, if you look at how people dealt with protection during a sword encounter, you'll see things like in a lot of the very practical Iberian and Spanish fencing systems, the idea of touch, the idea that if you could keep in contact your weapon to the opponent's, you could prevent yourself from being cut, okay? The other things that you see are distance, okay? Controlling, maintaining a proper fighting distance, okay? And this is something that is very important for our understanding, okay? So these focal points, okay, they all are the practical way that you approach knife combat. Along those lines, they have some drawbacks as well. So, for example, when you deal with traditional systems where touch is the main focal point, you see it in the Spanish systems, you see it in the Haitian machete systems as well. Circular movements, maintaining control with touch of your opponent's weapon. It tends to not allow your other arm into the fight. And when you're in a life and death kind of a combat situation, you want to be able to use your other hand. So if you train that way, even if you actually hold another weapon in your other hand, it still reflexively does not connect the same way to your understanding and reflexive movement than if you actually don't use that as a focal point. Okay? So it's important to understand that when you start to approach combat from a bladed perspective, you don't build bad habits. You're doing the same thing regardless of the skill set. You're trying to create reflexive habits that are almost instinctive, okay? And that allow you to be in the right position so that you can make your attack and the person cannot attack you. Okay, it's all very basic on that level, but very complicated to properly train that way. But the idea is very simple. Whatever you do, whether you're forcing a person back, creating the right distance, okay, moving a certain way, you want to be able to cut, attack, hit whatever your opponent and not have the opponent be able to do the same to you. Now, how this translates. So when you start to look at striking, we'll call striking Kempo. We'll use a general term here. And Kempo, translated as a fist, we can use that in lieu of things like Kopo-jitsu, okay, Daken-jitsu, and Koshi-jitsu, which are all different, more distinctive approaches that we use in our system. But we can even generalize that to karate, okay? Because karate is a very good example of how the pedagogy applies that we're talking about. And everybody sort of has an idea about karate. When I talk about karate, I'm not talking about what you see nowadays where people are bouncing around and flicking a hand or a foot. I'm talking about where you're in a very explosive position. You're trying to hit the person to break them, okay? And that's how you're successful. Either to break them, to unbalance them sufficiently so that you can continue your attack on that same level, okay? And make it so they cannot harm you, all right? Same parameters that we use with the sword, okay? So in using those parameters, the first thing that is a big problem, and the thing that we're going to address starting in the next video, is what do you focus on in your training when you're working with sword? And again, you can apply this to whatever the skill set is, but we're trying to connect sword technique to practical results, okay? And it's along those lines that we're going to have this discussion, okay, for the sake of Brian and others who might have an issue trying to really grasp this understanding, okay? So we're going to get into more specifics in the next video, but suffice to say, for the remainder of this video, when you look at arts that have a track record for giving you information about how combat took place and what worked and what didn't work, there are very few arts that actually have documented information empirically that has been recorded by eyewitnesses, etc., that have shown what works and what doesn't. And despite what anybody may think, the Koryu traditional arts of Japan are in fact the most realistic arts that we have to work with, because they have a documented history from being used on the battlefields, okay? And this includes even things as a cohesive unit, making adjustments, okay? You can see this when you look, for example, at the two wars fought with the Mongolian hordes, okay? Japan made tremendous changes and modifications from the first attack to the second attack during the Mongolian times, okay? Even though they won both times. If you look at the Iberian arts, when they entered Japan, you will see that there was a collaboration. I actually have texts in my library between Iberian Spanish sword work and Japanese sword masters who wanted to understand different approaches to the blade. Okay? So the idea that Kyoryu arts are dead and laughable things that people do as reconstructions is ignorant. It simply is a manifestation of what Hatsumi Sensei called the Ura and Omote view. Okay? Omote is what we physically see, it's what we experience collectively. Okay? The Omote is what, the Ura is what is hidden underneath that, the occult, that which is unseen. Okay? Hiding in plain sight, we have arts that are useful if you really understand how to unpack them. And why am I mentioning all this? Because I'm trying to explain to you why our nexus, our focal point, is on the sword, which is interesting because if you also understand Japanese combat history, you will understand that the sword was actually a latecomer to the Japanese combat bugai arts. Okay, it was preceded by archery, which is probably the most prevalent, and the spear. So, nevertheless, the sword came to represent a very special quality, and I believe the reason for that has to do with when you understand sword, the other things that you're capable of doing with that understanding. Okay. Again, if you look at Kyoryu training forms, two-man forms, you will see that inevitably they look very simple. The movement is straight line. It's deceptive because if you've ever understood and been in a combat situation, you will understand the skill it takes to maintain a proper distance from your opposition. And you learn this approach for a number of reasons. The first being that service to your art. You want to be able to take that information and teach others. Okay? Think of your forms as a physical textbook in which you can take and pass on, almost like a text that you read. Second, those concepts are instrumental, and you have to really reflexively understand them before you start dealing with angles and subtlety, tricks, and other such things. Okay? When the Japanese want to kind of mock the American understanding of combat and kind of keep things where a lot of deceptive information was passed on or very little was given, they always refer to their art as tricks. Okay? That's not by accident. Because the tricks, the little things that we like to focus on, really have nothing to do with the success of the training, which is based on principles of distance, timing, and intent. Okay? All right, we're going to move on to our next video now where we talk about the specific elements of the sword and how they apply to striking and generalize that concept.